Returning from Bermuda and her shakedown cruise on Christmas Eve, the ship would remain in the Navy Yard until 6 January 1944. This afforded many of the crew time for shore leave over the holidays. They knew that when they returned, there would be little chance to see loved ones again for some time. Late on Thursday, 30 December, the ship was moved into dry dock number 2 at the Navy Yard. By 2045, she was sitting on keel blocks, and yard crews began to repair a split that had formed in the hull between frames 204 and 305. Apparently, the stress test had taken more of a toll on the vessel than realized. The repair was completed over the day on 31 December, New Year's Eve. On New Year's Day, 1944, the dry dock was flooded. The ship refloated and moved over to berth 20, Pier K in the Navy Yard. The holidays were over and it was a brand new year. On Thursday, 6 January 1944, the crew was all back from leave. Halsey Powell spent 7 January escorting the freshly repaired cruiser, USS Philadelphia, on post-repair trials. On Sunday afternoon, 9 January, DD-686 received orders to escort the Philadelphia to Norfolk, Virginia. The two vessels got underway, and a night of sailing brought them to the mouth of the Chesapeake Bay. Entering the Chesapeake, Halsey Powell was released from escort duty and proceeded to NOB Norfolk. By noon, she was moored at berth 56. Tuesday, 11 January, the crew of DD-686 went from being trainees to being trainers. Just 3 months ago, the crew was here in Norfolk, learning the ropes from other Fletcher crews. Now they were back. Only it was them that were teaching the newbies the ropes. For the next several days, they would be taking trainees out for day cruises on the Chesapeake, returning to port each night. Training duty in Norfolk was over. Orders were received to report to Pearl Harbor. At 15:30 on Thursday, 20 January 1944, all lines were cast off, and the USS Halsey Powell sailed from Norfolk. Her next port of call on this 8,000-mile journey was New Orleans. It took 3 days to sail down the east coast of the U.S., through the Florida Straits, and transit the Gulf of Mexico. The ship entered the mouth of the Mississippi at 09:15 on Sunday, 23 January. By 15:45, she was moored at the Standard Oil Dock in Chalmette, filling her tanks. The night was spent moored alongside USS Swearer, a Cannon-class destroyer escort, at the Navy Supply Depot in New Orleans. The next 2 days were spent in New Orleans, which afforded the crew some shore leave in this historic city. This is how Lieutenant Ed Collender remembered his time in New Orleans. "We got drunk as hell. A couple of our New York mobster crewmen borrowed a car and went cruising all night, then took it back to where they found it. Another crewman went so far that he was thrown in the cooler for the night." On Wednesday, 26 January, the Halsey Powell and the USS Swearer departed New Orleans. Once clear of the Mississippi Delta, the two destroyers rendezvoused with U.S. Army transports Kwajalein and SS Mexico. They would be escorting the transports to the Canal Zone. The group steered south-southeast, speed 16 knots. Early Friday morning found the group off the west coast of Cuba, sailing south. Sunday morning, the four vessels passed the sea buoy marking the entrance of the Panama Canal. When they had passed through the breakwater at 11:15, the destroyers were released from escort duty and parted ways with the two transports. The destroyers entered the canal, completing the transit by 18:30, and spent the night at Pier 18, Berth B, Balboa, Panama. After a day in port, DD-686 got underway at noon on Tuesday, 01 February. Destination, San Diego. After 6 days of sailing, Halsey Powell was securing mooring lines at the Broadway Street Pier in San Diego at 10 o'clock in the morning, Monday, 7 February. Waiting on the dock were 50 Marines with orders to come aboard for transport to Pearl Harbor. The Marines were put anywhere there was space. Fuel and supplies were also taken aboard. At 0800 on Tuesday morning, the ship was underway. Destination, Pearl Harbor, territory of Hawaii. Below decks, the crew could hardly move around with the additional 50 Marines that were aboard. DD-686 arrived in Pearl Harbor late in the afternoon on Saturday, 12 February 1944. They were very much aware that this is where the United States had entered the war. Just 2 years ago, the Japanese attacked the American fleet in Pearl Harbor, sinking numerous ships and killing more than 2,400 people. As they arrived, the most poignant reminder of that fateful day they could see was the wreckage of the USS Arizona protruding above the water's surface. When DD-686 arrived in Pearl Harbor, she was assigned to Destroyer Division 105, which was one of 2 destroyer divisions that made up Destroyer Squadron 53, or as the Navy liked to refer to it as, DesRon 53. DesRon 53, while formed on paper, had not yet been provided with all 9 of the new Fletcher-class destroyers needed to fill out her ranks. But America was working on that. New Fletchers were being built in shipyards on both sides of the U.S. Every few days, a new one arrived in Pearl Harbor. As they did, Pacific Command assigned them to their units. The Halsey Powell was attached to Division 105, DesRon 53, which would eventually have 5 ships. Division 106 would have 4. It would not be until 27 June 1944, when the brand new USS Wedderburn arrived at Pearl Harbor, that DesRon 53 would be a fully complemented fighting unit. Meanwhile, the vessels that were on hand were put to work. The ship would spend her first 3 months in the Pacific performing a combination of training, escort duty, reconnaissance, and routine patrols. When it came to escort duty, there was a continuous stream of tankers and freighters that needed protection from submarines, as they sailed out to supply the fleet which was operating out in the western Pacific. Another job the destroyers helped with was dealing with small garrisons of Japanese forces that were left on nearby islands. These forces were cut off from Japan when Americans swept across the Pacific. These outposts posed little threat as long as they remained isolated and cut off from reinforcement and supplies. This required patrolling by the destroyers. There was also the occasional reconnaissance patrol. Destroyers were sent out to recon the various islands and atolls still occupied by Japanese forces. And of course, there was the constant need to patrol the waters around the U.S. bases that were established to support the fleet as they pushed toward Japan. Failure to do so was an open invitation for a Japanese sub-commander to have a field day sinking ships in and around these anchorages. All of these assignments were considered more or less as operating behind the front lines. For now, DD-686 remained moored in Pearl Harbor, which provided time for the crew to go ashore and explore this tropical paradise. On Wednesday, 16 February, everybody was back aboard. The ship sailed south out of Pearl Harbor for a day of training. The next 2 weeks were spent refining skills already practiced. Then came something new: shore bombardment. The 5-inch battery fired shells at locations on Kwajalein Island, which was the first time the vessel shot its big guns at something other than the ocean. After several days of at-sea training, Halsey Powell returned to port. The crew spent time doing something they like to call loading beans, bullets, and black oil, slang for loading food, ammunition, and fuel. On Sunday, 27 February, DD-686 was assigned to Task Group 12.6. The group was made up of 6 destroyers with orders to reposition to the Marshall Islands. The Halsey Powell, along with the USS Callahan, the McDermott, the Laws, the Newcomb, and the Fraser formed up at 10:15 Monday morning and sailed west. The 2,300-mile trip would take 5 days. As the group neared the Marshall Islands on Friday, Halsey Powell and USS Newcomb detached from the task group and proceeded to the Majuro Atoll, entering the lagoon on Saturday morning, 4 March. They reported to Commander Task Group 50.17 for duty, which was part of the Fast Carrier Replenishment Group. 2 days later, on Monday, Halsey Powell was underway with the USS Newcomb and the destroyer escort USS Eldon. The three were providing an anti-submarine screen for a group of oilers that were returning to Hawaii after delivering fuel to the fleet in the Western Pacific. Halsey Powell was the ship in tactical command and took the center position, the Eldon on the port bow, the Newcomb on the starboard bow. The group steamed east at 14 knots, zigzagging during daylight. At 03:37 on Tuesday morning, 7 March, the Eldon reported having a sound contact. The convoy made an emergency 45-degree turn to the right. The Eldon remained behind to investigate, but was unable to re-establish the contact. At 1100, Halsey Powell had a sound contact. The formation again executed an emergency turn to the right. The contact proved to be a false alarm, and the all-clear was given. At 12:30, yet another sound contact was made. Another turn to the right. This time, the Halsey Powell dropped a pattern of 5 depth charges. They flashed and thudded below the surface. White geysers of spray erupted from the sea. If nothing else, the explosions would tend to scare off a lurking enemy submarine. All was quiet until 1500, when another sound contact was made, bearing 310 degrees, distance 300 yards. DD-686 dashed to the location and dropped another 5-charge pattern. Either sunk or scared off, it seemed to do the trick. No further sound contacts were made for the remainder of the trip. On Wednesday, 8 March, the group crossed the 180th Meridian, which also marked the end of Halsey Powell and USS Newcomb's escort duty. It was now up to the USS Eldon alone to get the oilers safely back to Hawaii. Halsey Powell and Newcomb reversed course, returning to Majuro Atoll on Friday morning, 10 March. New orders came on Sunday, 12 March. Halsey Powell now reported to ComServron 10. That's Commander Service Squadron 10 for duty. Late in the afternoon on 15 March, Wednesday, DD-686 was underway out of Majuro to patrol the Japanese-occupied atoll of Mili, 85 miles southeast. The Japanese garrison on the atoll had become cut off from Japan when American forces overtook the Marshall Islands. Now, surrounded by the American Navy, they posed little threat as long as they stayed there. And that is exactly what Halsey Powell would be doing, by making sure Japanese submarines did not reinforce or supply their forces on the island. During darkness, she patrolled 3 to 7 miles off the northern side of the atoll, paying particular attention to the entrances. At first, patrols were uneventful. Then, after sundown on 18 March, the crew got some excitement. At 20:30, they were nearing the eastern limit of their night patrol. That's when radar began painting a surface contact, bearing 080 degrees, distance 14 miles. The vessel appeared large and wasn't transmitting any IFF signature. That's identification friend or foe. The contact, cruising on course 270 degrees, drew closer. Radar began to show 4 separate ships, 1 large, 3 small. Were they enemy or friendlies? The guys in CIC didn't know what to think. It seemed unlikely a group of 4 Japanese warships could have made it this far into American-controlled waters without being detected. But there they were, clear as could be on radar. Raising suspicions even further, attempts to radio the group were unsuccessful. They were not squawking any IFF signature, and they weren't responding to radio calls. This was not shaping up real good. Finally, after the 3rd attempt, the USS Intrepid and her 3 escorts responded. The crew breathed a sigh of relief. The rest of the patrol went without incident. After being relieved of patrol duty by the USS Newcomb, she returned to Majuro on Monday, 20 March. On Tuesday, 21 March, orders were received to patrol 180 miles northwest, in the vicinity of Wotje Atoll. Wotje was another atoll still occupied by Japanese forces, cut off from their military and surrounded by the Americans. That evening, Halsey Powell and the USS Hull, a 1,400-ton Farragut-class destroyer, set off for their patrol. The first 24 hours went without incident. Then, after sundown on Thursday, 23 March, Halsey Powell made radar contact with a surface target, bearing 237 degrees, distance 2,200 yards. The ship went to general quarters and closed on the contact. The hull remained behind, dealing with a rudder malfunction. An arc lamp was struck. There it was, big as life. A submarine with a Japanese flag flying from its fantail, 1/3 of a mile away. The Mark 37 Fire Control Director locked on the sub and sent range down to the fire control computer. The 5-inch battery began to swing around, but the sub submerged and disappeared before a shot could be fired. The soundman could hear the vessel operating below the surface. 9 runs were made on the sub's position, dropping charges on 7 of them. Just after midnight, DD-686 turned the hunt over to the USS Hull when she ran out of depth charges and lost sound contact with the sub. But the hull also was unable to reestablish the contact. At 04:20 that morning, the hunt was joined by the 1,100-ton destroyer Escort, USS Manlove, and the 450-ton patrol craft PC-1135. Radar began painting a return north of the Halsey Powell's position. After several sweeps, the target disappeared from the scope. Both the Manlove and PC-1135 had sound contact and sprinted to the sub's location. PC-1135 fired a pattern of mousetrap charges, anti-submarine rocket-propelled mortars, that were launched in a pattern 500 feet in front of the ship. 2 distinct explosions were heard, after which sound contact was lost. Not sure if they got the sub or not, Halsey Powell and Hull remained on scene and continued to watch and listen. After sunrise, an oil slick and bubbles were spotted on the surface, but a kill could not be positively confirmed. Halsey Powell and the Hull eventually had to give up the search and proceeded on their mission to patrol the entrance to Wotje Atoll during the hours of darkness. In fact, it wasn't until after the war that it was verified they had sunk the Japanese submarine I-32, the Eniwetok. After sundown on the evening of 24 March 1944, Halsey Powell with the USS Hull 1,000 yards astern were steaming eastward on a recon patrol past the southernmost island of the Wotje Atoll. Radar reported painting a surface contact about a half-mile south of the atoll, bearing 041 degrees, distance 8,800 yards. General quarters was sounded and battle stations manned. They suspected another Japanese submarine was trying to reach and resupply the isolated outpost. The 2 destroyers approached the target. A firing solution was obtained using radar information, and 2 torpedoes were launched. The USS Hull launched an additional 3. 2 explosions were observed, but based on the timing, it's likely the torpedoes impacted the shoreline rather than the target. The ship's Mark 37 fire control radar locked on to the return, and the 5-inch battery began firing. Radar followed the target as it entered the lagoon of the atoll. Star shells were fired, and what appeared to be a medium-sized landing craft could be seen. The fire control director locked on to the target, and the 5-inch battery rained shells down upon the craft. Another salvo was fired and more splashes formed near the vessel. As the spray dissipated, the target was gone, sunk. Firing ceased at 21:30. If the craft had rendezvoused with a submarine, whatever supplies it carried were now on the bottom of the lagoon. At 2200, Halsey Powell received orders to proceed to American-occupied Atoll, which was just 5 miles south of Japanese-occupied Wotje. This is how close some of these isolated Japanese outposts were to American bases, literally within eyesight of each other. Halsey Powell restocked her depth charges, then departed for another night of patrolling off Wotje Atoll. The rest of the patrol was routine with the exception of Sunday afternoon, 26 March. The pilot of an F-4U Corsair that had just attacked enemy positions on Wotje radioed his engine had quit and was bailing out. At 1300, DD-686 was dispatched to search for the pilot. By 1400, they had spotted a trail of green iridescent dye in the water. At its source was a one-man raft containing Marine Captain Lynn E. Midkiff. Captain Midkiff was brought aboard, wet, but none the worse for the wear. On 29 March, the Halsey Powell and Hall were relieved of patrol duty and returned to the base at Majuro Atoll. Thursday, 30 March, it was back to escort duty, which started a series of runs between Eniwetok and Kwajalein. It started with the Halsey Powell and the USS Hull escorting the USS Pecos, a 5,700-ton oiler loaded with fuel, from Majuro to the base in Kwajalein Atoll, 280 miles to the northwest. It was a one-day voyage and they arrived without incident the following day. On 2 April, Halsey Powell and the USS Alden were underway, escorting the USS Keokuk and Shinkapen, both net layers, and the Liberty ship SS William Glackens to Eniwetok, 400 miles northwest. That trip took 2 days, and the group was delivered safely on Tuesday, 4 April. That afternoon, it was back to Kwajalein, escorting Liberty ship SS Foxworth. Thursday, 13 April, it was back to Eniwetok, escorting the USS Prince George's, a 4,000-ton cargo ship loaded with supplies for the base. While waiting for the next escort job on Saturday morning, 15 April, the call came for a search and rescue mission. By 1000, Halsey Powell was searching for the crew of a seaplane that had gone missing southwest of the atoll. They sailed the area in a crisscross search pattern, while overhead, aircraft flew an aerial grid as they too searched for the lost crew. Despite searching throughout the day and overnight, no survivors were found. DD-686 had to return to Eniwetok empty-handed. The next day, 16 April, the Prince George's was unloaded and needed to return to Hawaii. Halsey Powell and the 900-ton minesweeper, USS Sage, got the duty. They took her as far as the 180th Meridian, then returned to Kwajalein. By Monday, 24 April, they were moored in Kwajalein anchorage. Halsey Powell's behind-the-scenes escort duty was about to come to an end. Orders were received to report to Pearl Harbor.